So we're in the second week of our Bible Hack sermon series, and certainly in the middle of our Bible boot camp. We've kind of tagged these two things together, and the Bible Hack series is going to be talking about how do we navigate some of the maze of our questions. And I told you last week you actually can solve this maze. Just do it after the sermon's over. We're trying to kind of navigate some of those questions, and then the Bible boot camp is kind of adds to that, deepens it, and also ask a whole different set of questions. So it's not too late if you didn't come last week. I am extremely proud to report that last week we had 192 people go through our Bible boot camp deal. 192. And our average attendance is like 400 people, and 135 or 40 of those are children and students. And of course, we actually had a fifth grader that went to our Bible boot camp. We had students that went to our Bible boot camp, and we had a large percentage of our adults that went. So it is not too late to go. There's one happening right now. If you get up and leave, it will hurt my feelings, but I'd be happy for you to go. And then, of course, we'll have it again tonight. We'll have it Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, and Thursday night. We try to make it as easy as possible for you to find a time to both study the Scriptures, understand the meta story, the big story of the Bible from Genesis to Revelations, and kind of how it's all connected, but also just to even get connected to some other people in the church. So we really encourage you to do it. Each one of these, they don't build necessarily on one. Like if you go today and you didn't go last week, just know that you're not going to, it's not like you're going to have no idea what's going on or anything. They're pretty much standalone lessons. We really welcome you to do that. This morning we're going to be looking in John chapter 20. Last week we tackled some of the question of, creation and who is God and who are we, and then what do we learn about how, sin and brokenness entered into the world. And this morning we're going to be really asking kind of the question of how do we know that we can trust the Scriptures? And let me just say that there's more information on this than I can share in a 25-minute time frame. I'm going to try to give you what I believe are kind of the best arguments for helping us understand that we can trust the Scriptures, both in terms of how they've passed information down through time and also some of the exclusive, these huge claims that they make about Jesus in particular. So we'll be looking particularly at the New Testament, but really the big question is how do I know I can trust the Bible? This morning we're going to be looking in John chapter 20. Look, we're going to look at the life of Thomas just briefly this morning, because I don't know about you, I can relate to Thomas. I think we all probably, if we're honest with ourselves and with each other, we can relate to Thomas. So this is in John chapter 20, and we're coming in kind of in the middle of the story. Jesus has appeared Jesus has lived, he has died, and then he has come back to life. He appeared to his other disciples, but Thomas was out doing something else. I don't know if he was running errands or what, but Thomas was not there. And so the resurrected Lord appears to the other disciples except for Thomas. And of course, they come to Thomas and are like, "Hey, you got to see, he was here, he's alive," this kind of stuff. And of course, this is Thomas's reaction to that whole scene. So now Thomas, it says, this is John chapter 20, starting in verse 24 through 31. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails are, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, "Put your fingers here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Will you guys pray with me? God, what a privilege it is to hear from you. We're thankful that your word still speaks today. It's not some dead book that was written thousands of years ago. God, I pray this morning that it would indeed speak to us. I pray, God, further that if you want to use me, that my words would somehow speak a word on your behalf, and if not, let them fall to the ground, God, and speak a word in spite of me. We didn't come here to hear me talk. We came to hear a word from you, and that's what we pray, and we pray it in the precious name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. There probably was a man named Jesus of Nazareth. Those were the first words I heard in my freshman year of college at the University of Texas, that noble institution. In my Rome and early Christianity class, my professor started the class by saying those words, there probably was a man named Jesus of Nazareth. Friends, my head was spinning. I mean, I was raised in a church-going family. My parents are highly educated people. They went to church. They made us go to church. I mean, I was raised in the church. Now, I was new to my faith. I was still trying to figure out if I was ready to believe and trust in Jesus, and I was right around that time is when I did give my life to Christ. But so I was still investigating some things, but I have to be honest with you to tell you I had never even considered the question whether or not Jesus of Nazareth had ever existed. Like, that had never even crossed my mind, right? I mean, I in that moment, I had a million thoughts. I was sitting there thinking to myself, have my parents been duped? Right? Could it be that Jesus never really existed? Could it be that I have been duped? Could it be that we are all being fed a steady dose of myths and legends and things that never actually happened? Friends, I had never considered that. Now, don't get me wrong. Of course, as a human being, I had considered the question of whether or not Jesus was really Emmanuel, God with us, whether or not his death really could have been on behalf of my sins, whether or not this dead prophet from Galilee had actually come back to life. All those questions. Of course I had asked those questions. We all ought to ask those questions. Those are exclusive claims, and they demand in some ways for us to really investigate those questions. So I had thought about whether or not Jesus really was who he said he was, but I had never considered the question, did Jesus never really exist at all? My head was spinning. And I was thinking to myself, is college going to be the death of my faith? That's what I was thinking. Now, friends, I went through the rest of the class. To be honest, I don't even remember what the guy said the rest of the lecture, because all I could do was think of that question. And I wanted to get to a place, because I'm not the kind of person, and I was not raised as the kind of person that just accepts things blindly. I do not believe that we as followers of Jesus are required to take our brains and remove them from our heads and set them on a pedestal before we walk into the back of a church. In fact, I suggest that we are not at all called to do that. And so I started asking myself, all right, I got to go back to the beginning here. I have to ask myself, before I can even ask the question of, is Jesus who he said he is, I have to ask myself, did Jesus even exist? Was he even alive? Can I trust the Bible stories, or are they just some sort of stories? And so I did. I started going on that kind of journey. I'm still on that journey. I hope that you're all on that journey as well. But friends, one of the things I learned in that class, and I have learned since that class, is, friends, if we believe that Julius Caesar lived, we certainly can believe that Jesus Christ lived. If we believe that Homer lived, we can believe that Jesus lived. If we believe that Plato lived, we can believe that Jesus lived. If we believe that Aristotle lived, we can believe that Jesus lived. I no longer have any question in my mind. There are plenty of biblical and extra-biblical sources that confirm that a man named Jesus walked the face of the planet. But that didn't really answer my other questions. I mean, what about all these miracles, and what about all these stories of what he did? What about his teaching? Can we trust those things? I mean, like you, in the age of social media, I see all these videos, and certainly I have atheist friends and people who show these things. And it's like, well, there's all these errors in the Bible, and there's transmission errors over time. I've heard the number as many as 200,000 errors of hand copying these manuscripts over a period of centuries and millennia. And so people will say, well, maybe the Bible story, it's been corrupted. Maybe the text of the Bible has been corrupted. And maybe everything that we read, everything that we see, everything that we try to take in and try to base our faith on, maybe it is so corrupt, it's so different from the original that we just shouldn't believe in it at all. These are the kinds of questions that people ask. They are the kinds of things that we see out there on social media. I'm certain I am not the only one who has that question. And so again, I've been on this journey of faith, of what does it mean, and what can we know about the Scriptures. Now, friends, again, I don't have time to run through every piece of evidence. You can find a ton of evidence and a ton of people who are into the field of what's called apologetics, of making the case in very strong terms. I just want this morning to make a few points that I think are strong cases. Now, I can't get you. Thomas wanted to put you in, he wanted to be in the room. And he wants to be able to touch the scars and place his hand in the side, and he wants to be able to take Jesus. It's kind of comparable to us wanting to take Jesus and put him in a test tube and want to drip some little chemicals in there, and he'll just come back to life, and we'll just see it, and he'll just be right there. And we want to prove it beyond any doubt whatsoever. We want to scientifically prove, experientially prove, by seeing it with our own eyes and touching his hands with our own. We want to put it beyond the realm of any doubt whatsoever. Now, friends, I can't get you in that room. I wasn't there and you weren't there, and we can't put Jesus in a test tube, and we can't go back, and we can't do some of those things that we, like Thomas, would want to do. But friends, that does not mean that we have to check our brains at the door. Let me just kind of give you some statistics. Maybe this is a helpful exercise. So one of the things people say is that the Bible might be unreliable because there are errors. One of the things people say is that maybe the Bible, maybe we don't even have the original documents, which if you don't know that, we don't. We don't have the original documents. I mean, these are a bunch of different writers wrote these different books and different letters, and so eventually they got compiled, but we don't have any of the original letters. We don't have any of the original documents. And so people say, well, how can we trust it? We don't have the original documents. Let me just give you some statistics. So this morning, I have right here in my hand, I have 7 pieces of paper. These 7 pieces of paper represent the number of manuscripts that we have from Plato. All right, from the philosopher Plato. Now Plato, we have 7 existing copies of his work. We don't have any of the originals. And the time elapsed from the time the originals were written to our first existing copies. You know how many years it was? 1,200 years. We have 7 copies. The first existing copies we have are 1,200 years after the original. All right, that's Plato. Then there's Aristotle. We have 49 copies, right? 49 copies, 7 times more copies than we have of Plato. We have 49 copies of Aristotle's works. We don't have any of the originals. The earliest ones that we have, the earliest texts that we have in existence. You know how many years between the originals and the earliest manuscripts that are surviving? 1,200 years. 1,400 years for Plato, 1,200 years for Aristotle. Sophocles, a playwright. Oedipus Rex, right? Sophocles, 193 copies. That's a lot more, right? That's a lot more copies than 7 or 49. 193 copies of Sophocles' works. Don't have any of the originals. The time between the originals and the nearest existing copies, 1,400 years. Now this is one that you may have actually read. Homer's The Iliad. Anybody read Homer's The Iliad? Anyone? All right. Do they still make people read this book? I had to read this in high school. Homer's The Iliad. So we have Homer's The Iliad. Now that's a lot, right? There's a lot of copies here. We actually have fewer than 650 copies. We have 643 copies of Homer's The Iliad. We do not have the originals. And the time elapsed. Now this moves a lot better. This is a lot better than 1,400, 1,200, and 1,400 years. The earliest existing copies that we have, since we don't have the originals, the early existing copies we have are 500 to 700 years after the original. That's Homer's The Iliad. We probably can say at this point that there probably existed a man named Homer, and he probably wrote a book called The Iliad, right? 643 copies. That's the runner-up. Now, friends, I want now to kind of help you understand. I want you to compare the number of manuscripts that we have of the New Testament, for instance. So, you guys ready? Y'all go ahead and bring them out. This will take a minute. Just talk amongst yourselves. I even have a sticky note that says the Bible right there. Is that it? Good, because we have things to do here. That's good. You know how many ancient manuscripts we have of the Bible, of the New Testament? We have 25,000. This is 50 reams of 500 sheets of paper, 25,000 manuscripts of the Scriptures, of the New Testament. The time, now we don't have any of the originals, as I said. You know how much of the time elapsed between the originals being written and the first partial manuscripts we have? We think about 40 to 50 years. Not 1,400, 1,200, 1,400, or 5 to 700, 40 to 50 years. The first complete, remember, they had to take the different manuscripts and put them into one book. The first complete manuscript that we have of all of the books is about 300 years after. So we have partial fragments, and we have particular books starting in 40 to 50 years. And then the first complete manuscript that we have is about 300 years after they were written. Friends, we can absolutely, if nothing else, we absolutely can say that there was a man named Jesus. There was also extra biblical evidence that I don't have the time to go in today, but we certainly can use this information to understand transmission, right? Because we have this many different manuscripts, we can compare them, and people have compared them, as you might imagine. And so the people who say, well, gosh, from the first manuscripts to the last manuscripts, there's 200,000 errors. Yeah, there are 200,000 errors. You know what happens when you take, so for instance, you take out all the spelling errors. Remember, these are hand copied, friends. These are hand copied by people. Until Gutenberg, they didn't have a printing press where they could actually set the type and make sure that everything was exactly the same being passed down. These are handwritten copies. The languages that they're being written in, the characters are very similar to one another. They didn't have eyeglasses. They worked with candlelight. If you take out just the mistakes they made of spelling errors, if you take out the transposition of a subject and a verb, which, by the way, in the ancient language doesn't even change the meaning of the sentence like it does in English. If I say in English, man eats dog, or dog eats man, those are two very different, and disturbing, sentences, right? Either way, but it doesn't. It changes the meaning in English. It does not change the meaning in ancient Greek, for instance, if you transpose the subject and verb. If you take out those basic mistakes, or they wrote this line above this line on accident, if you take out just the basic mistakes that don't change the basic meaning of the text, the transmission errors between all of the text across these 25,000 texts is 99.5% pure transmission. The runner-up, Homer's Iliad, they do the same kind of thing, 95% accuracy in transmission. Friends, nobody questions whether or not Homer's Iliad is trustworthy. Neither should we doubt that the things that have been transmitted in the Scriptures are pure from start to finish. Now, that does not mean, by the way, that they're true, right? That's a whole different claim. I'm not trying to say that because we have a lot and because they're accurately transmitted, you could transmit the same lie 99.5% of the time over a period of 25,000 manuscripts, over a period of 1,500 years or whatever, So let's examine the truth claims. Now again, I can't get you in the room. I can't get your hand in the scars or in the sides. But I also don't think that we have to completely check our brains at the door. Friends, we just have to leave the archaeological. We have to leave the realm of physical science, and we have to move into the realm of what I would call behavioral science. Friends, this story that we read this morning of John is just one. It's just one of the stories where we see the disciples prior to the resurrection just kind of messing stuff up. Right? I mean, we see this all the way from the very beginning. Jesus, he comes and he recruits his disciples. And from that time, often they get it right and often they get it wrong. Sometimes they do all the right things and they say all the right things, but sometimes they just mess it up. They argue about things like who's going to sit on Jesus' right hand in the kingdom and who's going to sit on Jesus' left hand in the kingdom, who's going to be greater and who's not going to be the greatest, and all those kinds of questions. Of course, we know from the scriptures that we see that the disciples, for instance, they doubt who Jesus is. They betray Jesus. They deny knowing Jesus. Friends, before and up to and just after the crucifixion, the disciples are kind of, sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong. They're kind of bumbling along the journey like so many of us do. But friends, starting in this moment, in this scripture that we just read this morning, at this moment of resurrection, something happens to those disciples, because from this moment on, they are completely different people. They become these kind of super disciples. They go kind of crazy. They love in a crazy way. They serve in a crazy way. They go and they do things boldly, even to their own detriment, even to their own punishment, even to their own imprisonment, and even, yes, we believe all but maybe one of the disciples was martyred for their faith, even to their own death, Now, so let's look at what are the two things that could have happened. Well, I would suggest to you that either in both of these, we ought to take seriously. We ought to ask these questions. One of two things happen, I would suggest to you. One of them is that they get locked in this room, they're afraid, they've seen Jesus die, and they're out of work, and they don't know what they're going to do, and they've left their homes and their families and their careers and their fishing nets and all that stuff to go follow him, and so now they're going, what are we going to do? And so either they did one of two things. Either they decided, hey guys, listen, if we just kind of change the story a little bit, if we can just agree to tell people that Jesus came back to life and we can kind of make this whole new kind of thing happen and we can go tell that story, if we can get people to believe that story, and as long as we lock arms really well, we can get people to believe that story, and then we'll have a livelihood again, and we can still have the same kind of, we pin our shoulders back and we're disciples of the resurrected King, right? And that would be one thing that could have happened in that room. But from a behavioral science perspective, somebody would have to explain to me why these disciples would have believed and would have created a lie and then not only told it, but told it even though it cost them their lives. I want to ask you a question. I'm not suggesting you do this, all the students and the children in the room, but certainly we've all made mistakes when we were kids, and we might have told our parents that we were going somewhere that we weren't going. Hey, I'm going to go spend the night at Billy's house or Susie's house when I really am going to go somewhere else. Would you die for that lie? Or maybe you didn't have the flu this week, but you really wanted to have the flu, and so you called your boss and you said, I can't come in this week because I feel really sick. And your boss said, you know what, I'm not convinced. I don't believe that you are sick. I'm going to come to your house. And now listen, I'm going to give you one opportunity to tell me that you're not sick, and I will let you come on in and you can do your job and you can keep your job. But if I come to your house, I'm gonna flu test you myself. I'm gonna swab your throat, and I'm gonna put it in the little 2-minute, throat swabbing test to see if you have strep throat, whatever you call that. And if you're not sick, you will lose your job. Anyone gonna stay with the lie? Absolutely not. Friends, why would we believe, from a behavioral science perspective, that whatever happened to these men would have been that they colluded on a lie? Why would we believe that they would be willing to make up a lie and then to follow that lie even to their own arrest and punishment and brutalization and death? Why would we believe that? That doesn't make sense to me. There's one other thing that could have happened in that room. I suspect there may be some others, but there's one thing that the Bible claims happened, and I think it's a reasonable explanation for what happened. The other thing that could happen was they saw a dead guy come back to life. The other thing that could have happened was that their crucified Messiah became a resurrected one. The other thing that could have happened was that they realized that everything Jesus had been saying was true. And they were forever transformed by that experience. And then they went out and they lived it differently. They loved, they boldly proclaimed when people threatened them. They kept proclaiming when people put them in jail. They kept proclaiming when people killed them. They kept proclaiming. Go read the book of Acts and see how these disciples and the other apostles who came after them, see how they acted. Go read from the early church stories. One of my favorite martyr stories is the story of Polycarp. You've heard me tell this a dozen times, of the guy who was one of the last remaining disciples of one of the last remaining disciples. He was a disciple of the apostle John. And Polycarp, he's a bishop of a town called Smyrna. He's tied up to the stake. They're getting ready to light the flame. They want him to admit that Caesar is God, and which would mean that he would be saying that Jesus is not God. All we want you to do is say that. And you've heard me say before that what Polycarp said to them was, 87 years have I served him, and he has done me no wrong. Why would I blaspheme my God who saved me? Friends, something changed those original disciples, and they transmitted that life change down through history. You're sitting here today because something happened in that room. And I believe it was the resurrection. I'm not sure what else would explain these disciples being willing to put their lives on the line. And then, if that's true, if the fundamental claims of the New Testament are true, that Jesus is God, that He lived a perfect life, that He taught us how to live God's love well and how to do it perfectly, even though we can't execute it perfectly, and if we believe that Jesus died on the cross for our sins and He came back to life so that we could have life, if those claims are true, then we certainly can have confidence that they have been transmitted through time accurately, more so at least than any other ancient manuscript that we have in our possession at this time. Friends, I don't know what you'll do with that evidence. Go read the Case for Christ. Go look on, you can see all kinds of apologetics tonight or this morning or tonight or this week. If you go to Bible Boot Camp, we'll talk some more about some of these things. But friends, the truth is, my hope is, and the reason the New Testament was written, the reason the Gospel of John was written, as you heard it said this morning, was so that we would have the same reaction that Thomas did. I can't get you in the room to put your hand in his scars. I can't get you there to put your hand in his side. I can't get you to see it with your own eyes, but I also do not think we have to check our brains at the door. Friends, just by investigating the evidence, I think we can get to the same place that Thomas got. I think we can fall down on our knees and say what Thomas said. An act of worship, an act that would have been blasphemy in the Jewish tradition. He said to Jesus in that moment, "My Lord and my God." That's my prayer. Don't take my word for it. You can take His word for it.